The Bristol Engine Company's experimental BE.5 3-power plant first ran on a testbed at Patchway, just north of Bristol, on the 2nd of September 1959. It produced 11,000 pounds of thrust and, more importantly, it could redirect that thrust through 4 rotating nozzles. The concept had not originated in Britain at all. Michel Wibolt, a French aeronautical engineer working under contract to the Mutual Weapons Development Programme in Paris, had sketched the idea of a vectored thrust ground attack aircraft in 1956. His design called for a Bristol Orion turboshaft driving 4 centrifugal blowers. It was, by any measure, mechanically absurd. Stanley Hooker at Bristol thought so too, but he saw the underlying principle. By redirecting bypass air through swiveling nozzles, a turbofan could lift an aeroplane vertically and then propel it forward, all without separate lift engines cluttering the fuselage. Sir Sidney Cam at Hawker Aircraft in Kingston upon Thames received the proposal in the summer of 1957. Cam, the designer of the Hurricane and the Hunter, was famously sceptical of fashionable concepts. His response to Hooker, recorded in the Hawker archives now held at Brooklands Museum, ran to a single sentence, asking what use such a contraption might possibly serve. Yet Cam assigned the project to a young engineer named Ralph Hooper, and Hooper transformed Wibolt's awkward sketches into something coherent. The resulting design, designated P.1127 within the company, featured a single Bristol engine with 4 nozzles arranged in pairs along the fuselage sides. 2 forward nozzles exhausted cold bypass air. 2 rear nozzles handled the hot core flow. The pilot rotated all 4 together through a single lever in the cockpit. The Ministry of Supply showed no initial interest. NATO, Basic, Military Requirement 3 had called for a supersonic vertical takeoff strike fighter, and the P.1127 was firmly subsonic. Hawker proceeded anyway, funding the prototype from company reserves until the Treasury reluctantly contributed £75,000 in 1959. The first tethered hover took place at Dunsfold Aerodrome in Surrey on the 21st of October 1960, with test pilot Bill Bedford at the controls. Bedford had broken his ankle in a car accident in Germany 3 weeks earlier and flew the hover wearing a plaster cast, an inconvenience he chose not to mention to the Hawker board. What made the British approach distinctive was its restraint. The Pegasus engine, as the BE.53 came to be known, was a single integrated solution. The aeroplane had no separate lift engines. It had no thrust augmentation burners spitting raw fuel into the exhaust. It was, in the truest engineering sense, a clean piece of work. The nozzle bearings ran on air rather than oil. The gyroscopic forces of the contra-rotating compressor spools cancelled each other out, and the centre of thrust passed almost exactly through the aircraft's centre of gravity in every flight regime. This elegance would prove important 15 years later when Soviet engineers attempted to reverse engineer what they could see from satellite photographs and Western airshow appearances. They saw the shape. They saw the nozzles. They did not see, because they could not see, the thousands of small design decisions inside the Pegasus that made the whole concept work. The Harrier program, by the time the Royal Air Force accepted its first GR Mark I into No. 1 Squadron at RAF Wittering on the 1st of April 1969, represented 12 years of accumulated British engineering judgment. None of that could be photographed. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov became Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy on the 5th of January 1956. He inherited a fleet built primarily for coastal defense, with a submarine arm of considerable strength and a surface force of almost no oceanic relevance whatsoever. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 confirmed what Gorshkov already suspected. When American carrier groups closed the quarantine line around Cuba, the Soviet Navy could offer no equivalent response. There were no aircraft carriers in the Soviet order of battle. There was no naval fixed-wing aviation capable of operating from a ship. The lesson, Gorshkov wrote in his subsequent memorandum to the Defense Council, was that a navy without organic air cover was a navy that could only protect its own coastline. The contrast with Britain was acute. The Royal Navy, even in its diminished post-Suez condition, operated HMS Ark Royal, HMS Eagle, HMS Hermes, HMS Victorious, and HMS Centaur. Each carried a complement of Sea Vixen all-weather fighters, Buccaneer strike aircraft, and Gannet airborne early warning machines. The Admiralty's Future Fleet Working Party, sitting in Whitehall through the autumn of 1962, had already begun discussing the eventual replacement of these conventional carriers with smaller through-deck cruisers operating vertical takeoff aircraft. The discussions were classified, but their existence was no secret. Soviet naval attachés in London read the same Jane's fighting ship's entries as everyone else, and they reported back to Moscow that the Royal Navy was thinking seriously about ships that could carry the Hawker P.1127 and its successors. Gorshkov's response took shape over several years. The first element was the Moskva class of helicopter cruisers, two vessels laid down at Nikolaev in 1962 and 1965. These ships carried 14 Kamov anti-submarine helicopters each and were, in essence, a Soviet answer to the Royal Navy's commando carriers. They were not, however, capable of operating fixed-wing aircraft, and Gorshkov knew it. The second, and more ambitious element, was the Project 1143 program, eventually realized as the Kiev-class. These were larger vessels, displacing 43,000 tons, with an angled flight deck running along the port side and a full missile cruiser armament forward. They were designed from the outset to carry vertical takeoff jet aircraft. The difficulty was that no such Soviet aircraft existed. Yakovlev's earlier experiments with the Yak-36 had produced a research vehicle of marginal utility. The Mikoyan and Sukhoi Design Bureau, when approached in 1966, both declined to take on the naval requirement. Sukhoi was committed to the T-4 reconnaissance bomber. Mikoyan was absorbed in the MiG-23 swing-wing program. The Council of Ministers consequently issued Decree No. 186 on the 28th of December 1967, directing the Yakovlev Bureau to produce a shipboard vertical takeoff strike fighter within 5 years. 5 years was, given the state of Soviet vectored thrust technology, a fantasy. What is striking, reading the declassified Soviet naval staff papers now held at the Russian State Naval Archives in St. Petersburg, is how clearly Gorshkov's officers understood what they were attempting. A memorandum dated the 17th of March, 1968, prepared by Vice Admiral Smirnov, observed that the British had spent over a decade refining the vectored thrust concept, and that any Soviet aircraft built to a shorter timetable would necessarily compromise on engineering quality. The Politburo was not interested in this assessment. Soviet prestige required parity, or the appearance of it, and the Kiev was already laid down. The hull was being built. The aircraft would have to follow, ready or not. Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev was 61 years old when the file landed on his desk at the OKB-115 Design Bureau on Leningradsky Prospect in Moscow. He had designed the Yak-3 fighter that had outflown the Messerschmitt 109 over Kursk. He had designed the Yak-25 all-weather interceptor and the Yak-28 tactical bomber. He had never, in 40 years of aircraft design, built anything that took off vertically. The folder he received from the Council of Ministers in January 1968 contained reconnaissance photographs of the Harrier GR Mark I, intelligence reports compiled from open-source British aviation press, and a one-page summary of what the Soviet Navy required. The summary specified a maximum takeoff weight of 11,000 kilograms, a combat radius of 240 kilometers carrying 1,000 kilograms of ordnance, and a first flight date of 1971. The photographs were of limited value. They showed the external shape of the Harrier, the position of the four nozzles, and the configuration of the air intakes. They did not show the inside of the Pegasus engine, the design of the pufferjet reaction control system at the wingtips and tail, or the carbon fiber nozzle bearings that allowed the Harrier to rotate its thrust without seizing under load. Yakovlev's deputy, Stanislav Mordovin, who would become chief engineer for the project, later told the aviation historian Yefim Gordon that the Bureau spent 3 months simply trying to understand what they were looking at. The fundamental question was whether to copy the Pegasus principle, with a single engine driving multiple nozzles, or to adopt a different architecture entirely. The Pegasus approach was rejected for reasons that were partly technical and partly political. Technically, no Soviet engine manufacturer in 1968 could produce a turbofan with the bypass ratio and nozzle geometry of the Bristol design. Politically, copying the British engine directly would have required the Soloviev or Tumansky Bureau to admit that they could not match Bristol's metallurgy, and neither bureau was prepared to make that admission to the Central Committee. Yakovlev therefore chose the alternative path. The new aircraft would use one main propulsion engine for forward flight, supplemented by 2 dedicated lift engines mounted vertically behind the cockpit. This arrangement, sometimes called the composite power plant scheme, had been studied in Britain during the early Hawker P-112-7 work and discarded as inefficient. Yakovlev had no choice but to adopt it. The aircraft was designated Yak-36M, the M standing for Modifizirovanie, meaning modified, although in truth it was an entirely new aeroplane sharing only the general layout of its predecessor. The Rybinsk engine plant was directed to produce the RD-27 main engine, derived from the existing R-27 turbojet used in the MiG-23. The Kolosov Bureau in Rybinsk was assigned the RD-36-35 lift engines, each producing 2,900 kilograms of thrust. The 2 lift engines, mounted behind the pilot at an angle of 10 degrees from vertical, would fire only during takeoff and landing. For the remainder of any sortie, they would be dead weight, occupying a section of the fuselage that, in the Harrier, was filled with fuel. The timetable, issued by the Council of Ministers, required first flight in early 1971. Yakovlev's engineers, working from a brief they had not requested and to a deadline they had not agreed, began drawing in February 1968. The mock-up commission convened at the Bureau's premises in November of the same year. Few present believed the deadline could be met. None said so aloud. Western intelligence had first glimpsed Soviet vertical takeoff ambitions at the Domodedovo air display on the 9th of July 1967. The aircraft that performed there, designated Yak-36 and bearing the NATO reporting name Freehand, was not the production machine that would eventually become the Yak-38. It was an experimental research vehicle, built in a run of 4 prototypes, intended to validate the basic concept of jet-borne vertical flight in Soviet conditions. 2 examples flew at Domodedovo that summer afternoon, performing brief hovers and slow transitions before landing vertically on a marked pad. The watching Western Air attachés, including Group Captain Maurice Smith of the British Defence Staff in Moscow, reported what they had seen to London by encrypted cable that evening. Smith's assessment, now held in the Defence Intelligence Staff files at the National Archives in Kew under reference DEFE 25, was that the Soviet display had been impressive in appearance but technically primitive. The Yak-36 was powered by two Tumansky R-27 300 turbojets mounted side by side in the nose. Each engine drove a single rotating nozzle, with the two nozzles working in parallel to provide vertical thrust during takeoff and forward thrust during cruise. Reaction control jets at the nose, tail, and wingtips bled from the main engines, provided attitude stability at low speeds. The arrangement was crude. The two nozzles, sitting forward of the center of gravity, made the aircraft pitch sensitive in the hover. The reaction control system consumed enormous quantities of bleed air, robbing the main engines of thrust at precisely the moment maximum thrust was needed. The Yak-36 could lift itself off the ground. It could not lift itself off the ground carrying anything useful. What Smith and his colleagues at the British Embassy did not know in July 1967 was that the Yakovlev Bureau had already concluded the same thing. The Domodedovo display was a piece of political theatre, staged for Soviet Aviation Day and intended to demonstrate parity with the West. Behind the public performance, the Bureau's internal reports, later catalogued in the Yakovlev archive at Tchaikovsky, described the Yak-36 as a dead end. The aircraft could not be navalized. It could not carry ordnance. It could not even take off vertically with full fuel. The decision to build the Yak-38 as an entirely new design, with the lift and cruise engine arrangement described in the previous section, was a tacit admission that the freehand had failed. Test pilot Valentin Mukhin, who flew the Yak-36 on the majority of its development sorties from the Zhukovsky Flight Test Center southeast of Moscow, recorded in his subsequent memoirs that the aircraft was the most dangerous machine he had ever flown. The hover was unstable in any crosswind exceeding 5 meters per second. The transition from vertical to horizontal flight required the pilot to manage two separate throttles, the nozzle, vector control, and the reaction control system simultaneously, all whilst maintaining attitude on instruments that were not designed for low-speed flight. 2 of the 4 prototypes were lost during the test program. Both pilots ejected successfully, but the loss rate of 50% was unacceptable even by Soviet standards. The freehand program was quietly terminated in 1970. The surviving airframes were dispatched to museums. The lessons learned, such as they were absorbed into the Yak-38 design office. By the time Group Captain Smith filed his final assessment from Moscow in the autumn of that year, the Soviet Navy had already committed to a successor aircraft that would inherit most of the original's problems without solving any of them. The decision to use 3 engines instead of 1 was, in the end, the decision that doomed the Yak-38. The arithmetic was unforgiving. A Harrier GR Mark I, leaving RAF Wittering on a typical training sortie in 1970, carried 23,000 pounds of thrust in a single Pegasus Mark 101 engine. That thrust was available at every point in the flight envelope. It lifted the aircraft off the ground, propelled it forward at 540 knots, and lifted it again when the pilot returned to base. The engine weighed 3,000 pounds. The aircraft weighed 12,000 pounds empty. The thrust-to-weight ratio with internal fuel exceeded 1-to-1 in the vertical mode. The Yak-38, by contrast, carried 3 engines weighing a combined 4,200 kilograms. The main Tumansky R-28 V Yak-300 produced 6,700 kilograms of thrust. The two Kolesov RD 3635 lift engines added a further 5,800 kilograms between them. The total installed thrust of 12,500 kilograms was, on paper, comparable to the Harrier. In practice, it was nothing of the sort. The two lift engines contributed thrust only during takeoff and landing. For the remaining 95% of any sortie, they were inert mass occupying a section of the fuselage that could otherwise have held fuel. The aircraft's empty weight rose to 7,300 kilograms, leaving a useful payload on a hot day from a pitching deck of barely 600 kilograms. The consequences for the pilot were severe. The lift engines were fed by a separate inlet door behind the cockpit, which had to open precisely on cue during the transition to vertical flight. If the door failed to open, the engines could not start. If the engines started, but their thrust output diverged by more than 3%, the aircraft would roll uncontrollably. The automated control system fitted to the production Yak-38, designated SAU-36, attempted to manage this complexity by removing the pilot from the loop entirely. During vertical landings, the system commanded throttle settings, nozzle angles, and even ejection if the parameters exceeded preset limits. Soviet test pilots referred to the aircraft as the Widowmaker, the official Yakovlev Bureau histories notwithstanding. The ejection statistics confirmed the assessment. Between 1974 and 1991, the Soviet Navy lost 37 Yak-38s from a total production run of 231 airframes. The loss rate, calculated per 10,000 flying hours, was approximately 5 times that of contemporary Harrier operations with the Fleet Air Arm. The automated ejection system saved most of the pilots, although the seat itself, the K-36VM, was prone to firing without warning during normal flight if the aircraft's attitude sensors malfunctioned. At least 2 pilots were ejected from serviceable aircraft over the Mediterranean during routine deck operations from the Kiev. Compared to the British solution, the Soviet design was an exercise in compromise stacked upon compromise. The Pegasus, with its single integrated thrust source, allowed the Harrier to perform short rolling takeoffs from a ski jump ramp, doubling the useful payload. The Yak-38 could not perform a rolling takeoff in any meaningful sense because the lift engines had to be running at full power before the aircraft left the deck. It could not deflect thrust in forward flight to enhance maneuverability, the technique known to British pilots as VIFF-ing. It could not, in short, do most of the things that made the Harrier worth building in the first place. The cruiser carrier Kiev passed through the Bosphorus at first light on the 18th of July, 1976, southbound from the Black Sea Fleet Base at Sevastopol towards the Mediterranean. Turkish observers at the Dolmabahce shore station counted the aircraft on her flight deck and signaled the count to Ankara, which passed it to the Allied Command Europe headquarters at Naples. 3 Yak-38s stood lashed to the aft deck, alongside a single Yak-36 development airframe and 14 Kamov Ka-25 anti-submarine helicopters. Royal Navy photographic interpreters at HMS Mercury near Petersfield in Hampshire received the intelligence imagery within 48 hours, and the assessments compiled there now sit in the Naval Historical Branch files at Portsmouth under reference NHB/Kiev/76. The Royal Navy's interest was acute. HMS Invincible, the first of the new through-deck command cruisers, had been launched at Vickers Barrow on the 3rd of May the previous year. She was designed to carry 8 Sea Harrier FRS Mark I aircraft, then still in development at Kingston. The Soviet Navy appeared, to outward appearances to have stolen a march on her by deploying an equivalent vessel 3 years earlier. The Director of Naval Intelligence, Vice Admiral Sir Louis Lebailly, briefed the First Sea Lord at the Ministry of Defence main building in Whitehall on the 22nd of July. His assessment, declassified in 2005, was that the Kiev represented a serious operational capability that the Royal Navy could not yet match. That assessment proved overly generous. The Yak-38s aboard the Kiev during her transit to her new station with the Northern Fleet at Severomorsk flew a total of 47 sorties in the Mediterranean. Each sortie lasted approximately 17 minutes. The aircraft carried no ordnance during the deployment, only a centerline fuel tank. Western maritime patrol aircraft, principally Royal Air Force Nimrod MR Mark Is, operating from RAF Kinloss in Malaysia, photographed every launch and recovery. The Nimrod photographs, examined by the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre at RAF Brampton in Huntingdonshire, reveal the operational restrictions under which the Yak-38 had to be flown. Launches occurred only when the wind across the deck fell within a narrow envelope. Recoveries required the ship to steam at reduced speed, removing relative wind that might disturb the lift engine inlet flow. Multiple aircraft could not be in the air simultaneously because deck space and the ship's air traffic procedures could not accommodate two Yak-38s in different stages of vertical flight. The British Naval Staff, having examined the photographs in detail, revised their assessment downwards through the autumn of 1976. A paper prepared by the Naval Staff Directorate of Operational Requirements, dated the 14th of November and now held at the National Archives under reference ADM 344/22, concluded that the Yak-38 was a propaganda aircraft rather than an operational one. The paper noted that no Soviet aircraft had yet demonstrated the ability to take off from the Kiev with anything resembling a useful warload. It noted that the loss rate during initial sea trials in the Black Sea, reported by signals intelligence from the Kiev's onboard communications, had exceeded one airframe per 100 sorties. What the Royal Navy had spent 12 years quietly perfecting at Kingston and Dunsfold, the Soviet Navy had attempted in 8 years at Chukovsky and was now demonstrating, with cameras present, to be a hollow capability. The Kiev sailed on towards the Norwegian Sea. The Yak-38s remained, mostly, on her deck. The Kiev's second extended deployment took her south rather than north. In the spring of 1979, she sailed from Severomorsk through the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, monitored throughout her passage by Royal Air Force Nimrods and the SOSUS hydrophone array, and turned east through the Strait of Gibraltar towards the Indian Ocean. Her destination was the patrol station off the Horn of Africa that the Soviet Navy maintained from facilities at Berbera in Somalia, and later the South Yemeni port of Aden. The deployment lasted 11 weeks. It almost destroyed the Yak-38 program. The problem was air temperature. A jet engine produces thrust by accelerating a mass of air through its nozzle. The hotter and thinner that air, the less mass passes through the engine in a given time, and the less thrust is produced. Every jet aircraft loses performance in tropical conditions, but the Yak-38, with its tightly calculated thrust margin in the vertical mode, lost performance catastrophically. At sea level air temperatures exceeding 30 degrees Celsius, the combined output of the three engines fell below the aircraft's empty weight. The machine could not lift itself off the deck. With internal fuel and no ordnance, it could not even hover. The British had encountered the same physics with the Harrier and had solved it with a piece of engineering elegance. The Pegasus engine, on production GR Mark III aircraft from 1971 onwards, was fitted with a water methanol injection system. Distilled water carried in a tank above the engine could be injected into the combustion chambers during takeoff, cooling the inlet air and increasing mass flow. The system added approximately 2,000 pounds of available thrust for a period of 90 seconds, sufficient for vertical departures from any tropical airfield the Royal Air Force might be required to use. Number 1 Squadron at RAF Wittering had practiced this technique routinely during exercises at Akrotiri in Cyprus and during the Belize reinforcement deployments of the early 1970s. The Yakovlev Bureau had not fitted water injection to the Yak-38. The reasons, recorded in the Yakovlev archive material later examined by the historian Andrei Fomin, were twofold. The lift engines were not designed to accept water injection without significant modification. And the additional water tank, displacing fuel that was already in critically short supply, would have reduced the aircraft's combat radius to a figure too embarrassing to publish. The decision had been taken in 1972 to accept the temperature limitation rather than admit it. By 1979, in the Gulf of Aden, the consequences became operationally undeniable. Vice Admiral Vladimir Kapitanets, commanding the deployment, signaled Moscow on the 7th of June requesting permission to suspend Yak-38 flight operations until cooler weather permitted. His signal, intercepted by GCHQ at Cheltenham and circulated within the Defence Intelligence Staff, noted that of the 4 aircraft embarked, none had completed a successful vertical takeoff in the preceding fortnight. 2 had attempted launches, settled back onto the deck, and damaged their tail sections against the aftergun mount. The Soviet Navy's response was to ship the aircraft back to the Black Sea aboard a freighter and replace the Kiev's air group with helicopters alone for the remainder of the cruise. The episode confirmed what the British naval staff had concluded 3 years earlier from photographs alone. The Yak-38 was an aeroplane that could fly only in a narrow band of atmospheric conditions, from a deck steaming at the right speed, in winds within the correct envelope, carrying almost nothing. It was, in operational terms, a demonstration model. The decision to deploy 4 Yak-38s to Shindand airfield in western Afghanistan was taken at a meeting of the Soviet Defense Council on the 12th of March 1980. The aircraft would not operate from any Soviet ship. They would fly from a conventional concrete runway at an elevation of 1,150 meters above sea level, in conditions of high temperature and thin air, to demonstrate the type's capability as a tactical strike platform. The deployment, designated Operation Rhomb, was overseen by Yakovlev test pilot Yuri Mitikov and a detachment of 40 technical specialists from the Saki Naval Air Station in Crimea. It would prove to be the only combat deployment the Yak-38 ever undertook. The 4 aircraft arrived at Shindand aboard an Antonov An-22 transport on the 18th of April. They flew their first operational sorties on the 22nd. The sortie rate was immediately disappointing. At Shindand's altitude, with summer temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius by midday, the aircraft could not take off vertically with any ordnance whatsoever. The detachment resorted to short rolling takeoffs along the concrete runway, a technique for which the Yak-38 was poorly suited because the lift engines had to be running at full power throughout the ground roll, consuming fuel at a rate that further reduced the available payload. Each sortie carried 2 200-kilogram bombs. The combat radius, with this load, was approximately 100 kilometers. The targets selected for the deployment were Mujahideen positions in the surrounding mountains, attacked at the request of Soviet ground forces engaged in clearance operations through the Farah and Herat provinces. The bombing accuracy was poor. The Yak-38 had no laser designator, no radar capable of mapping ground targets, and no navigation system more sophisticated than a basic Doppler unit calibrated for naval operations over featureless water. Pilots dropped their bombs by eye in shallow dives from approximately 1,000 meters against targets they could often not positively identify. Soviet ground forces requested the deployment be terminated within 4 weeks, and Operation Rhomb concluded on the 7th of June. The official Soviet Air Force assessment, prepared at the Lipetsk Combat Training Center and dated the 15th of September 1980, ran to 140 pages. It concluded that the Yak-38 had no useful tactical application. The aircraft's combat radius was too short, its payload too small, its avionics too primitive, and its serviceability rate too low to justify continued development as a land-based strike type. The naval variant, the assessment noted, suffered from the same limitations, compounded by the additional constraints of shipboard operation. The Defense Council received the report and shelved it. Production of the Yak-38 continued at the Saratov Aviation Plant until 1989, by which time 231 airframes had been completed at a cost the Soviet Treasury never published in full. The Royal Air Force flew the Harrier in combat for the first time during the Falklands campaign of 1982, 2 years after the Shindand deployment. Number 1, Squadrons GR Mark IIIs flew from HMS Hermes alongside the Fleet Air Arm's Sea Harrier FRS Mark Is, conducting ground attack sorties against Argentine positions on East Falkland and engaging Argentine aircraft in air-to-air combat with the Sidewinder AIM-9L missile. 21 Harriers operated throughout the campaign. None was lost to enemy aircraft. The contrast with Shindand was not lost on observers in either capital. The British aeroplane had been designed once and built properly. The Soviet copy had been designed 3 times and never finished,